The morning of June 19th, 1944, aboard the flagship USS Lexington, somewhere in the Philippine Sea, Admiral Marc Mitscher stood on the bridge watching his radar operators track the largest concentration of Japanese carrier aircraft since Midway. Over 400 enemy planes were inbound, launched from 9 Japanese carriers in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet and save the Marianas Islands. Mitscher gave a single order: launch everything. Within minutes, over 450 American fighters roared into the sky from 15 aircraft carriers spread across the Philippine Sea. The carriers bore names that would echo through naval history: Essex, Lexington, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hornet. Ships that had not existed 2 years earlier. Ships that Japanese naval intelligence had tracked with growing alarm and disbelief as they appeared, one after another, from American shipyards at rates that violated every assumption about industrial warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots, many with less than a year of training, slaughtered veteran Japanese aviators who had once been considered invincible. The exchange ratio was devastating. More than 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. American losses, fewer than 30 planes. But this battle was not won through superior tactics or pilot skill, though both mattered. It was won in the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Norfolk. It was won by welders and riveters, by engineers and industrial planners, by a nation that had transformed its economy so completely that Japanese military analysts could not accept the evidence of their own intelligence reports. The story of how America built 24 Essex-class carriers while Japan's carrier construction program effectively collapsed is not merely a tale of industrial capacity. It is a story of intelligence failure, strategic miscalculation, and the terrible mathematics that determined the outcome of the Pacific War long before the final battles were fought. November 8, 1943, Tokyo, Japan. In a nondescript office building near the Imperial Palace, Captain Tatsukichi Mio sat at his desk, surrounded by intelligence reports that should have been impossible. Captain Mio served in the 4th Section of the Naval General Staff, responsible for tracking Allied naval construction. His job was to know, with precision, how many carriers the Americans possessed, where they were building them, and when they would enter service. The reports before him documented something unprecedented in naval history. Since January of 1943, American shipyards had commissioned 1 Essex-class fleet carrier approximately every 2 months. Essex, herself in December of 1942, Yorktown in April 1943, Lexington in February, Bunker Hill in May. The pattern continued, relentless and accelerating. Captain Mio had spent the previous week cross-referencing every available source: radio intercepts mentioning carrier names, signals intelligence tracking ship movements, reports from neutral diplomats, photographs from German reconnaissance when available, agent reports from sympathetic sources in neutral countries. Every source confirmed the same impossible conclusion. The Americans were not just building fleet carriers faster than any nation in history. They were building them at rates that exceeded the combined output of every shipyard in Japan, operating at maximum wartime capacity by factors that seemed to defy physical possibility. He pulled out a chart he had prepared for the Naval General Staff. The data was clinical, undeniable, devastating. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy possessed 7 aircraft carriers total. By late 1943, barely 2 years into the war, they would possess over 30 carriers of all types. The Essex class alone represented industrial capacity that exceeded everything Japan had built in the previous decade. Each Essex class carrier displaced approximately 27,000 tons standard. Each carried 90 to 100 aircraft. Each was equipped with sophisticated radar, advanced damage control systems, and anti-aircraft armament that made them extraordinarily difficult to sink. Each represented industrial achievement that Japan's shipyards, even operating at theoretical maximum output, could not match. The construction times defied Japanese understanding of shipbuilding. The Essex herself had been completed in just 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. The Franklin, built at Newport News, took only 14 months. Traditional Japanese carrier construction required 30 to 40 months minimum. The Americans were building fleet carriers in half the time, using construction techniques that Japanese naval architects had considered impossible. Captain Mio understood the strategic implications with terrible clarity. Japan had entered the war with 11 aircraft carriers. Through brilliant tactical operations in the first 6 months, Japanese carrier aviation had dominated the Pacific. But at Midway, in June 1942, 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers had been lost in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, ships that represented years of construction, decades of accumulated expertise, and pilot cadres that could not be replaced. In the 2 years since Midway, Japan had struggled desperately to rebuild carrier strength. New construction had been accelerated, commercial vessels had been converted, a few purpose-built carriers had been completed, but the mathematics were crushing. While Japan completed 3 fleet carriers in the 2 years following, Midway, the United States had completed 17 Essex-class carriers in the same period, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers, plus dozens of escort carriers for convoy protection. The disparity was not merely in numbers, it was categorical, representing fundamentally different levels of industrial mobilization. Japan was fighting a war of scarcity, carefully husbanding limited resources, unable to replace losses at rates necessary to maintain strategic equilibrium. America was fighting a war of abundance, accepting losses with the certain knowledge that replacements would arrive faster than ships could be sunk. Captain Mio had prepared a detailed memorandum for Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff. The memorandum documented American carrier construction with precision, projected future production based on current trends, and analyzed the strategic implications. The conclusions were professional, objective, mathematically certain, and they pointed inexorably toward Japanese defeat. He had hesitated before submitting the report. In the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1943, presenting unwelcome analysis was dangerous. Officers who questioned inevitable victory were accused of defeatism. Intelligence that contradicted strategic assumptions was dismissed as enemy propaganda. Captain Mio had watched colleagues quietly reassigned or sidelined for presenting accurate assessments that leadership found politically unacceptable. But his duty was clear. Intelligence officers existed to provide accurate information so that commanders could make informed decisions. Personal consequences were irrelevant compared to the imperative of presenting truth to leadership. He submitted the report on November 15, 1943, with full knowledge that it would be unwelcome. The response came within 3 days. The analysis was noted and filed. No strategic reassessment would occur. No adjustment to operational planning would be made. The Naval General Staff would continue pursuing offensive operations based on assumptions that American carrier strength remained limited and manageable. Captain Mio sat alone in his office, understanding with bitter certainty what this meant. The Imperial Japanese Navy would continue operations as if American industrial capacity did not matter. They would plan battles assuming rough numerical parity with American carrier forces. They would commit increasingly scarce resources to offensives that could not succeed because the fundamental mathematics of carrier availability made victory impossible. The story of how Japan failed to understand or respond to American carrier production begins not with intelligence failure, but with systematic institutional refusal to accept intelligence that contradicted cherished assumptions. Japanese naval planners knew the Americans were building carriers. They had access to reliable information about construction rates and timelines. They simply could not accept what the data meant. This cognitive failure had roots extending back before Pearl Harbor to fundamental miscalculations about American industrial potential that would prove fatal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned repeatedly that America possessed industrial capacity that Japan could not match in prolonged warfare. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, traveled extensively throughout the United States. He understood American industrial power firsthand. His warnings had been dismissed. Japanese naval leadership, trained in a culture that emphasized spirit over material considerations, believed that tactical excellence and fighting determination could overcome numerical disadvantages. They pointed to historical examples where smaller forces defeated larger opponents through superior skill and will. They assumed American society, viewed as soft and decadent, lacked the unity and sacrifice necessary for total war. Pearl Harbor was planned and executed with the explicit understanding that Japan needed to achieve decisive victory within 6 months before American industrial mobilization reached full strength. Yamamoto had told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe that he could guarantee tough fighting for 6 months, but had absolutely no confidence in outcomes beyond that time frame. The prediction would prove accurate almost to the day. The Battle of Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, June 4th through 7th, 1942. The battle was decided not through Japanese tactical failures, though several occurred, but through the vulnerability that American codebreakers had exploited. Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with detailed intelligence about Japanese plans from communications intercepts, positioned 3 carriers in ambush. The outcome is well known. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk, over 300 aircraft destroyed, approximately 110 pilots killed, representing roughly 25% of the air crews embarked on the 4 carriers. American losses were significant. The carrier Yorktown sunk, along with the destroyer Hammond, over 300 servicemen dead. But the strategic mathematics favored America overwhelmingly. Japan lost 4 carriers. America lost 1. More critically, Japan lost experienced pilots and trained maintenance crews that required years to replace. America had training programs and industrial capacity that could replace losses within months. After Midway, the carrier war became a race. Could Japan rebuild carrier strength faster than America could expand theirs? The answer was determined in shipyards and aircraft factories long before it was confirmed in combat. The Essex-class carrier program had begun before Pearl Harbor, with the first ship ordered in July 1940. The program represented American naval planning at its most ambitious. 32 ships were originally ordered, though only 24 would ultimately be completed. The design incorporated lessons from previous carriers, particularly the Yorktown class, while dramatically increasing size, aircraft capacity, and survivability. Essex-class carriers were larger than any Japanese carrier except the converted battleship Shinano. They displaced 27,100 tons standard, compared to approximately 25,675 tons for the Japanese Shokaku class, the Imperial Navy's best pre-war carriers. The size difference translated directly to operational capability. Essex-class carriers embarked 90 to 100 aircraft compared to 72 for Shokaku-class ships. But numbers alone do not capture the systematic advantages built into Essex-class design. The carriers featured improved armor protection, particularly around machinery spaces and magazines. Compartmentalization was extensive, with watertight bulkheads and damage and control systems that made the ships extraordinarily difficult to sink. Advanced radar systems provided early warning of approaching aircraft. Anti-aircraft armament was formidable, with 12 5-inch guns, 40 to 60 40mm guns, and dozens of 20mm cannons. The flight deck was longer and wider than Japanese counterparts, facilitating faster aircraft operations. A deck-edge elevator, positioned on the port side of the flight deck, allowed aircraft to be brought up from the hangar without interfering with flight operations. 3 aircraft elevators total provided flexibility in moving planes between hangar and flight deck. Catapults could launch aircraft quickly. Arresting gear could recover them efficiently. Everything about the design reflected lessons learned from earlier carriers, optimized for the specific demands of Pacific warfare. Long-range operations, sustained combat, vulnerability to aerial attack. The Essex class was built to fight and survive, in conditions where previous carriers had proven inadequate. Construction techniques represented American industrial engineering at its finest. Unlike traditional shipbuilding, which treated each vessel as essentially custom work requiring skilled craftsmen, Essex-class construction employed mass production principles borrowed from automotive and aircraft manufacturing. Hulls were built from standardized sections fabricated in parallel. Components were prefabricated and assembled like building blocks. Extensive use of welding rather than riveting reduced construction time. Special treatment steel, a nickel-chrome alloy equivalent to Class B armor, was used structurally throughout, providing protection while limiting weight. The results were remarkable. Average construction time for Essex-class carriers was approximately 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. Some were built faster. The Franklin took 14 months at Newport News. This compared to 32 months for the Cooper. Japanese carrier Taiho laid down only 3 months before Essex, but commissioned 16 months after. American shipyards worked simultaneously on multiple carriers. 4 different yards built Essex-class ships: Brooklyn Naval Yard, Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, Philadelphia Navy Yard, and Norfolk Navy Yard. Each yard operated with relative independence, building carriers in parallel. When one ship was launched, another keel was laid immediately. The production pipeline was continuous, with carriers in various stages of construction at all times. Japan, by contrast, had limited shipyard capacity and faced critical resource shortages that constrained construction. Steel allocation, increasingly scarce as the war progressed, had to be divided between carriers, other warships, merchant vessels, and army requirements. Skilled labor was limited. Specialized components like turbines and reduction gears required long lead times. Construction of a single fleet carrier consumed resources that might otherwise produce multiple destroyers or dozens of merchant ships. Japanese carrier construction after Midway reflected these constraints. The Taiho, completed in March 1944, was the only purpose-built fleet carrier Japan completed during the entire war. She was impressive, displacing 29,300 tons, larger than an Essex. She featured an armored flight deck, the first on a Japanese carrier, and sophisticated damage control systems. She carried approximately 60 aircraft, but Taiho was alone. One ship, taking 32 months to build, representing the absolute limit of Japanese industrial capacity dedicated to carrier construction. While Taiho was under construction, American yards completed 16 Essex-class carriers. Japan also built 3 Unryu-class carriers: Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi. These ships, based on the pre-war Hiryu class with improvements, displaced approximately 17,150 tons, standard. They carried 65 aircraft. They were smaller and less capable than Essex-class carriers, but represented realistic designs that Japanese industry could actually build given resource constraints. Unryu was laid down in August 1942, launched in September 1943, and commissioned in August 1944. 24 months from keel laying to commissioning, slower than American construction despite being a smaller, less complex ship. Amagi took 22 months. Katsuragi took 21 months. The construction times reflected Japanese industrial reality. Even with simplified designs and maximum effort, Japan could not match American construction speed. More Unryu-class carriers were ordered. Plans called for 14 ships total, but only 3 were completed before war's end. Construction of others was started then suspended due to material shortages, bombing damage to yards, and the simple reality that Japan lacked resources to complete them. Several were launched but never fitted out. Others had construction stopped when only partially complete. The steel and labor were needed elsewhere, for destroyers, for submarines, for weapons that might have more immediate impact. The most ambitious Japanese carrier project, the conversion of the battleship Shinano, illustrated both Japanese desperation and the futility of their efforts. Shinano was the 3rd Yamato-class battleship, laid down in May 1940, and originally intended to be the most powerful warship afloat. After Midway, with the carrier force devastated, the decision was made to convert the partially complete hull to an aircraft carrier. Shinano would be massive, 72,000 tons, fully loaded, the largest carrier built by any nation during World War II. She would carry 47 operational aircraft plus spare planes for other carriers. Her armoured flight deck and sophisticated damage control would make her nearly unsinkable. The conversion was rushed, with completion planned for 1945. She never reached operational status. Launched in October 1944, she was ordered to transit from Yokosuka to Kure for final fitting out. On November 29, 1944, less than 3 weeks after commissioning, the American submarine USS Archerfish intercepted her. 4 torpedoes struck Shinano. Poor damage control by an inexperienced crew, combined with watertight doors left open during transit, doomed the ship. She capsized and sank less than 20 hours after being torpedoed. Shinano's loss symbolized Japanese carrier aviation's complete collapse. The largest carrier ever built, sunk before conducting a single operational mission, lost with over 1,400 crew. The industrial capacity consumed building her produced nothing useful for the war effort. The steel, the labour, the resources could have produced dozens of escort vessels or hundreds of aircraft. Instead, they produced a ship that survived less than 3 weeks. By late 1943, when Captain Mio prepared his intelligence assessment, the pattern was unmistakable. American shipyards were delivering approximately 1 Essex-class carrier every 2 months. Japanese yards struggled to complete 1 carrier of any type per year. The disparity would only widen as the war continued. The strategic implications were profound and undeniable. Carrier warfare is fundamentally about numbers. Quality matters. Pilot skill matters. Tactical doctrine matters. But in sustained conflict between industrial powers, quantity determines outcomes. The side that can put more carriers to sea, that can replace losses faster than they accumulate, that can sustain operations indefinitely through superior logistics, will win through simple attrition. Japan began the war with 11 carriers and lost 4 at Midway. The remaining 7, plus new construction, gave Japan approximately 9 carriers available by late 1943. Of these, many were light carriers or converted ships with limited capability. Perhaps 4 or 5 could be considered fleet carriers comparable to American Essex-class ships. America, by late 1943, possessed over 30 carriers of all types. 17 Essex-class fleet carriers were commissioned or under construction. 9 Independence-class light carriers provided additional capability. Dozens of escort carriers supported amphibious operations and convoy protection. The numerical advantage was overwhelming. More critically, American production was accelerating while Japanese construction struggled under resource shortages and bombing. The mathematics pointed to only one possible conclusion. In any major carrier battle, America could afford to trade losses roughly 2 to 1 and still maintain numerical superiority. Japan could not accept any losses because replacements were not available. Every carrier sunk, every experienced pilot killed, every maintenance crew lost represented irreplaceable capability that weakened Japanese forces permanently. Captain Mio's intelligence assessment documented all of this with professional precision. He noted the specific commissioning dates of each American carrier. He calculated construction rates and projected future deliveries. He analyzed the implications for Japanese strategy, noting that offensive operations requiring fleet carrier support were becoming mathematically impossible because America could always deploy superior carrier strength. His recommendations were modest. Transition to defensive strategy that did not depend on carrier superiority. Husband remaining carrier forces. Focus construction on smaller ships that could be built faster and in greater numbers. Accept that Japan could not win the carrier war and adjust strategy accordingly. The Naval General Staff's response, when it came, was polite and dismissive. The analysis was technically sound, but overly pessimistic. Japanese pilots remained superior to American aviators. Japanese torpedoes and aircraft were qualitatively better than American equivalents. Tactical excellence and fighting spirit would overcome numerical disadvantages. American carriers, though numerous, were vulnerable to concentrated attack. One successful operation could restore the balance. Captain Mio understood what this meant. The Naval General Staff would continue planning operations as if American industrial capacity did not matter. They would commit scarce carriers to offensive missions that could not succeed. They would accept battles where numerical disadvantages guaranteed defeat. They would refuse to acknowledge reality until reality forced itself upon them with catastrophic violence. The pattern was not unique to naval aviation. Throughout Japanese strategic planning, there was systematic refusal to accept that industrial warfare favored the opponent with greater production capacity. Japanese military culture emphasized willpower, tactical skill, and spiritual superiority as the decisive factors in combat. Material considerations were secondary, even irrelevant, compared to the determination to fight and the willingness to sacrifice. This attitude had historical roots. Japan's military traditions came from samurai culture, where individual warrior virtue mattered more than numbers or equipment. Modern Japanese military training emphasized historical examples where numerically inferior forces achieved victory through superior spirit. The idea that industrial production might matter more than courage was alien to Japanese military thinking and psychologically impossible for most officers to accept. But industrial warfare operates by different rules. In conflicts between modern industrial nations, the side with greater production capacity can sustain losses indefinitely, while opponents with limited production capability are ground down through attrition. Quality advantages matter in individual engagements. Superior tactics can achieve favorable exchange ratios, but over time, across hundreds of battles and thousands of sorties, quantity overwhelms quality through simple mathematics. The Americans understood this instinctively. Their entire strategic approach to the Pacific War was built on the assumption that superior numbers would eventually overcome any Japanese tactical advantages. Plan Orange, the pre-war strategy for Pacific operations, explicitly assumed that American industrial capacity would prove decisive in prolonged conflict. The Essex-class carrier program was conceived specifically to provide numerical superiority that would make American victory inevitable. Japanese planners, in contrast, never fully internalized the implications of fighting an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity. They knew America was larger and richer. They understood that prolonged war favored the Americans, but they assumed that quick victories, territorial conquest, and defensive strongpoints would make the war too costly for America to continue. They gambled that American society lacked the unity and determination to sustain years of combat. Pearl Harbor was planned with this assumption. Strike the Pacific Fleet, cripple American naval power, seize territories throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, then negotiate peace from a position of strength. The strategy assumed Americans would accept negotiated settlement rather than fight a long war to reconquer distant territories. Instead, Pearl Harbor united American public opinion completely. The attack, perceived as treacherous and dishonorable, created national consensus for total war, unprecedented in American history. Isolationist sentiment evaporated overnight. Political divisions were set aside. The entire American economy mobilized for war production with speed and completeness that shocked observers. Admiral Yamamoto understood this would happen. He had warned that attacking America would awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve. His prediction proved accurate, but even Yamamoto, with his knowledge of American industrial capacity, probably underestimated the scale and speed of American mobilization. The Essex-class carrier program exemplified this mobilization. Planned before the war, accelerated dramatically after Pearl Harbor, executed with industrial efficiency that defied Japanese understanding. Within 2 years of Pearl Harbor, American yards were delivering carriers at rates that exceeded all Japanese carrier construction since 1930. The numbers tell a story that Japanese analysts struggled to accept, even when confronted with incontrovertible evidence. From December 1941 through December 1944, the United States commissioned 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, and over 70 escort carriers for convoy protection and amphibious support. This represented more carrier tonnage than had existed in the entire world before 1941. Japan, during the same 3-year period, completed 4 fleet carriers Taiho, Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi, plus the converted Shinano, which was sunk before becoming operational. Additionally, Japan completed several light carriers through conversion of existing vessels. The light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda were converted from seaplane tenders. The Ryuho was converted from a submarine tender. The Junyo and Hyo were converted from ocean liner hulls. Even counting all conversions and light carriers, Japan added approximately 12 carrier-type vessels to the fleet from midway through 1944. America added over 100 carriers of all types during the same period. The ratio exceeded 8-to-1, sustained across 3 years of maximum mobilization by both nations. But raw numbers understate the disparity, because American carriers were on average larger, more capable, better equipped, and more survivable than Japanese equivalents. An Essex-class carrier displaced nearly twice the tonnage of an Unryu-class ship, carried 50% more aircraft, possessed superior radar and fire control, and featured damage control systems that made it extraordinarily resistant to sinking. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would demonstrate these advantages with devastating clarity. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers for Operation A-Go, the Imperial Navy's attempt to destroy American carrier forces and prevent the invasion of the Marianas. The Japanese force included 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, representing virtually every operational carrier the Imperial Navy possessed. Ozawa's force carried approximately 460 aircraft total, roughly the same number the Kido Butai had embarked for Pearl Harbor. On paper, this seemed formidable. 9 carriers with nearly 500 planes should constitute a powerful striking force capable of inflicting severe damage on American forces. But the Japanese carrier force of June 1944 bore little resemblance to the Kido Butai that had struck Pearl Harbor. The ships were similar, some were actually the same vessels, but the pilots were fundamentally different. The experienced aviators who had trained for years before Pearl Harbor, who had perfected their skills in operations over China, who had achieved tactical mastery through hundreds of hours of flight time, were gone. Most had been killed in the battles of 1942 and 1943. Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons Campaign, all had consumed Japanese pilots faster than they could be replaced. The replacements flying from Ozawa's carriers in June 1944 had received minimal training. Japan's pilot training programs, never as extensive as American equivalents, had collapsed under the pressure of wartime demands. Fuel shortages limited flight training. Experienced instructors were unavailable, having been sent to combat units to fill gaps from losses. Training aircraft were scarce. The curriculum was shortened repeatedly to rush pilots into combat units. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest fighter aces, later described the training situation in 1943. Instructors had too many students. The pressure to produce quantity over quality overwhelmed the program. Students graduated with minimal flight hours, poor gunnery skills, inadequate tactical knowledge. They were taught how to fly and shoot, but not how to survive in combat against well-trained opponents. American pilot training, by contrast, had expanded dramatically and maintained rigorous standards. Flight schools across the United States produced thousands of naval aviators annually. Students received hundreds of hours of flight training before being assigned to combat units. Gunnery practice was extensive. Tactical doctrine was taught systematically. The training pipeline was long, expensive, and thorough, but it produced pilots who were competent, confident, and capable of surviving their first few combat missions, the critical period when inexperienced pilots were most vulnerable. Admiral Mitscher's Task Force 58, opposing Ozawa, consisted of 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and 96 supporting warships. The American force carried approximately 900 aircraft total, outnumbering Japanese aircraft by more than 2 to 1. More critically, American pilots averaged significantly more flight hours than their Japanese counterparts. American aircraft, particularly the F-6F Hellcat fighter, were superior to Japanese Zeros in speed, firepower, and durability. The battle that developed on June 19th demonstrated what happened when Japanese tactical tradition confronted American industrial reality. Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes totaling over 370 aircraft. American radar detected the raids while still over 100 miles away. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to optimal intercept positions. The Japanese formations were torn apart before reaching American carriers. The slaughter was comprehensive. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a term that captured both the one-sided nature of the combat and the professional contempt American aviators felt for their poorly trained opponents. Japanese planes fell from the sky by dozens, then by hundreds. Formations were decimated. Individual aircraft were hunted down. The few Japanese planes that reached American carriers faced massive anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with radar-directed gun directors and proximity-fused shells. By day's end, Japanese losses exceeded 600 aircraft. 3 carriers had been sunk: Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, destroyed by submarine attacks or aircraft strikes. The remaining carriers had lost virtually all their aircraft. American losses were approximately 130 aircraft, most due to operational accidents rather than combat. Fewer than 30 American planes were shot down by enemy action. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The exchange ratio exceeded 20 to 1, favoring America. This was not merely tactical superiority. It was categorical dominance, achieved through systematic advantages in training, equipment, logistics, and above all, numbers. American task forces could afford to be cautious, could prioritize defense over offense, could accept that some enemy aircraft would penetrate their defenses because the mathematical certainty of their industrial advantage made any losses temporary and replaceable. Japanese forces could not afford any losses. Every aircraft destroyed, every pilot killed, represented irreplaceable capability. By June 1944, Japan's industrial capacity to build aircraft and train pilots had declined sharply under the pressure of American bombing campaigns, fuel shortages, and raw material scarcity. The planes destroyed at the Philippine Sea could not be replaced. The pilots killed could not be trained. The carriers that survived the battle returned to Japan and never sailed again as operational units because aircraft and pilots to equip them simply did not exist. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a significant military force. Japan possessed carriers. Several survived and were technically operational, but they had no aircraft, no trained pilots, no fuel for operations, no prospect of restoration to combat capability. They were floating steel structures, obsolete the moment they lost their air wings. 3 months later, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers served primarily as decoys. Admiral Ozawa commanded a force including 4 carriers: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The carriers embarked approximately 100 aircraft total, less than a single American Essex-class carrier normally carried. Many pilots had only weeks of training. Some had never landed on a carrier before the operation. Ozawa's mission was not to fight. It was to lure American carriers away from Leyte Gulf so that Japanese battleships could attack the vulnerable amphibious forces landing troops. The strategy was explicit acknowledgement that Japanese carriers could no longer fight American carrier forces effectively. Their final purpose was sacrificial distraction, drawing enemy attention so that other forces might achieve objectives. The plan worked tactically. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, took the bait. Concerned that Japanese carriers represented the primary threat and eager to destroy them, he steamed north with his entire carrier force, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Japanese battleships nearly broke through to the landing beaches before being turned back by desperate defense from escort carriers and destroyers. But strategically, Leyte Gulf confirmed what the Philippine Sea had demonstrated. Japan had lost the carrier war completely and irreversibly. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, along with most of their aircraft and many pilots. American carrier losses were 0. Several escort carriers were damaged or sunk by Japanese battleships and cruisers, but the fast carrier task force suffered no significant damage. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. A few battleships survived, immobilized in harbors for lack of fuel. A handful of carriers remained afloat but were never sent to sea again. Submarines continued operations but with decreasing effectiveness. Destroyers and cruisers conducted occasional missions but faced overwhelming Allied superiority in every encounter. The final carrier missions were kamikaze operations, where pilots were explicitly not expected to return. This was not carrier aviation in any meaningful sense. It was aerial suicide using planes that happened to operate from ships. The entire concept of carrier warfare projecting air power across oceanic distances, maintaining air superiority, conducting sustained operations had become impossible for Japan because they lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses in carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots. American carrier task forces, in contrast, operated with increasing confidence and capability throughout 1945. More Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. Shangri-La was commissioned in September 1944. Bonhomme Richard in November 1944. Additional ships followed through early 1945. By war's end, 17 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned, with 7 more under construction. These carriers conducted operations off the Japanese coast with virtual impunity by early 1945. Task Force 58, later redesignated Task Force 38, launched massive strikes against Japanese home islands, destroying what remained of Japanese air power, sinking surviving naval vessels in harbor, supporting amphibious invasions at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Fast Carrier Task Force became the dominant military force in the Pacific, operating freely in waters that Japanese forces could no longer contest. The strategic shift was complete. Japan began the war with carrier superiority. Experienced pilots, well-designed aircraft, sophisticated tactical doctrine, and operational experience gave Japanese carrier aviation clear advantages in December 1941. 6 months later, at Midway, those advantages were largely intact, but numerical losses had begun eroding Japanese strength. By the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aviation retained some of its technical sophistication, but had lost the pilot quality that made it effective. By Leyte Gulf in October 1944, even the pretense of capability was abandoned. By 1945, Japanese carrier aviation simply ceased to exist as a meaningful military force. This transformation occurred not because of any single battle or tactical failure, but through the cumulative effect of American industrial mobilization. Every Essex-class carrier commissioned reduced Japanese relative strength. Every month of American production widened the gap between the combatants. The mathematics of industrial warfare made Japanese defeat certain once American shipyards began delivering carriers faster than Japanese forces could sink them. Captain Mio, preparing his intelligence reports in Tokyo throughout 1944, watched this process with the clinical detachment of a professional analyst. Each new American carrier detected through signals intelligence was documented. Each battle report was analyzed for implications regarding American carrier strength and capability. Each month brought additional evidence that Japanese carrier aviation was collapsing under the pressure of American numerical superiority. His reports continued to be filed and ignored. The Naval General Staff pursued operations that assumed rough parity with American forces. Plans were developed that required carrier strength Japan no longer possessed. Offensive operations were ordered that consumed irreplaceable resources without achieving strategic objectives. The disconnect between intelligence analysis and strategic planning grew wider with each passing month. This pattern was not unique to naval aviation. Similar dynamics played out in every aspect of Japanese war planning. Intelligence regarding American production was available, often accurate, systematically dismissed when it contradicted operational assumptions. The belief that willpower and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage persisted, even as evidence mounted that industrial capacity determined outcomes in modern warfare. Japanese aircraft production exemplified this. In 1941, Japan produced approximately 5,300 aircraft. In 1942, production reached 8,861 aircraft. In 1943, 16,693 aircraft. In 1944, production peaked at 28,180 aircraft. These figures represented maximum mobilization of Japanese industrial capacity, achieved through extended work hours, mobilization of additional labor, and prioritization of aircraft production over other war material. Yet American production in 1944 reached 96,318 aircraft. The United States built more than 3 aircraft for every 1 Japan produced, while simultaneously producing tanks, trucks, artillery, ships, and every other category of war material in greater quantities than Japanese industry could match. The disparity extended to every measurable category. The United States produced 86,000 tanks during the war. Japan built approximately 6,500. America manufactured 2 million military trucks. Japan produced approximately 165,000. American shipyards launched approximately 6,800 naval vessels. Japanese yards completed fewer than 1,000. In every comparison, across every category of military production, the ratio favored America by factors of 5 to 1, 10 to 1, sometimes higher. Steel production underlay every other comparison because steel is the foundation of industrial warfare. In 1944, American mills produced 81 million tons of steel. Japanese production reached approximately 20 million tons. The 4-to-1 advantage in steel translated directly to advantages in ships, tanks, aircraft, artillery, and every other product that required steel. The Japanese understood these numbers. Intelligence services documented American production with reasonable accuracy. Military planners had access to data showing the scale of American industrial output. They simply could not accept what the numbers meant that Japan was fighting an unwinnable war against an opponent whose industrial capacity made defeat mathematically certain, regardless of Japanese courage or tactical skill. This cognitive failure had roots in how Japanese military culture processed information. Facts that reinforced existing beliefs were accepted and amplified. Intelligence that contradicted strategic assumptions was questioned, reinterpreted, or dismissed as propaganda. Officers who presented unwelcome analysis were considered defeatist or lacking in fighting spirit. The institutional culture punished bearers of bad news and rewarded those who maintained optimism regardless of evidence. Senior leadership bore responsibility for creating and maintaining this dysfunctional information environment. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff through much of the war, repeatedly dismissed intelligence reports about American production as exaggerated. He insisted that American society lacked the discipline and unity to sustain total war mobilization. He believed that racial diversity and democratic governance made America weak, despite mounting evidence that American industrial mobilization exceeded all historical precedents. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who succeeded Nagano in May 1944, inherited a strategic situation that was already hopeless. By mid-1944, American forces had seized the Marshall Islands. The Marianas were under assault. The Philippines would soon be invaded. Japan's defensive perimeter was collapsing. The Imperial Navy had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-Midway strength. Carrier aviation no longer existed as an effective force, yet Toyoda ordered offensive operations that assumed Japanese forces could achieve decisive victories through superior tactics and fighting spirit. The Ago operation, which culminated in the Philippine Sea disaster, was planned explicitly to destroy American carrier forces through concentration of Japanese carriers and land-based aircraft. The plan assumed that Japanese pilots remained superior to American aviators, that tactical coordination could overcome numerical disadvantages, that one successful operation could change the strategic balance. The plan failed catastrophically because its assumptions were false. Japanese pilots in June 1944 were not superior to American aviators. Tactical coordination could not overcome 3-to-1 numerical disadvantages when the numerically superior side also possessed better equipment and superior training. One successful operation, even if achieved, could not change the Rastaliva strategic balance because American industrial capacity would replace any losses within weeks, while Japanese losses were permanent. The Shogo operations at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 represented Japanese strategic planning at its most desperate and delusional. The plan assumed that Japanese battleships could break through to American landing beaches if carriers served as decoys to draw away American naval forces. Success required American commanders to make specific tactical errors, Japanese forces to achieve surprise despite American signal intelligence advantages, and coordinated attacks by separated forces across hundreds of miles of ocean. The plan achieved limited tactical success. Admiral Kurita's battleship force nearly reached the landing beaches before withdrawing, but strategically, Leyte Gulf was the death of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships lost, multiple cruisers destroyed, and most critically, no realistic prospect of rebuilding strength sufficient to contest American naval dominance. After Leyte Gulf, Japanese naval strategy consisted entirely of kamikaze attacks and last-ditch defensive operations. This was not strategy in any meaningful sense. It was desperation, the flailing of a defeated military force that had lost the capacity for coherent operations but refused to acknowledge defeat. The kamikaze campaign that began at Leyte Gulf and intensified through Iwo Jima and Okinawa represented the final bankruptcy of Japanese military thought. Unable to defeat American forces through conventional operations, unable to replace losses in trained pilots, unable to achieve air superiority through skill or tactics, Japanese commanders resorted to suicide attacks that traded pilot lives for minimal damage to American ships. The kamikazes inflicted casualties. Several hundred American ships were damaged or sunk by suicide attacks. Thousands of American sailors died. But kamikazes could not change strategic outcomes because they could not sink enough ships fast enough to prevent American operations. American shipyards replaced losses faster than kamikazes could inflict them. American medical capabilities allowed many damaged ships to be repaired and returned to service within weeks. The Essex-class carriers proved remarkably resistant to kamikaze damage. Their heavy construction, armoured hangars, sophisticated damage control, and large crew size meant they could absorb multiple hits and remain operational. USS Franklin was hit by bombs and set ablaze in March 1945, suffering over 800 casualties, but remained afloat and was eventually repaired. USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes in May 1945, killing nearly 400 sailors, but survived and returned to port under her own power. Not a single Essex-class carrier was sunk during the entire war, despite facing submarine attacks, aerial bombs, and kamikaze strikes. The survivability built into their design, combined with excellent damage control training and American industrial capacity to provide repair resources, made them extraordinarily difficult to sink. This resilience meant that even successful Japanese attacks rarely removed American carriers from service permanently. The contrast with Japanese carrier vulnerability was stark. Of the 18 Japanese carriers that saw service during the war, 14 were sunk. The survival rate was approximately 22%. American carriers, including Essex-class, Independence-class light carriers, and escort carriers, suffered a loss rate under 15%. The difference reflected both design philosophy. American carriers prioritized survivability. Japanese carriers prioritized aircraft capacity and industrial reality. America could afford to build carriers that were harder to sink. Japan needed to maximize offensive capability because resources to build replacement ships were limited. By early 1945, the war's outcome was no longer in question. American forces had reconquered the Philippines. Iwo Jima fell in March after brutal fighting. Okinawa was invaded in April. American bombers ranged freely over Japanese home islands. B-29 superfortresses launched from the Marianas conducted strategic bombing campaigns that destroyed Japanese cities and industrial capacity. American submarines had strangled Japanese commerce, sinking over 60% of Japanese merchant shipping and cutting off raw material imports essential for industrial production. Japan's war economy had collapsed. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, which had motivated Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia, had ceased because tankers could not survive the submarine-infested waters. Food imports had stopped, creating civilian starvation. Industrial production declined sharply as factories lacked raw materials, skilled workers were depleted, and bombing destroyed facilities. The Japanese military remained capable of bitter defensive fighting, as Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated, but lacked the industrial base to replace losses or sustain prolonged operations. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 provided final punctuation to Japanese defeat, but the outcome had been determined much earlier. The decisions that led to Japanese defeat were made in 1941 and early 1942, when Japanese leadership chose to attack an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity, then refused to acknowledge the strategic implications when American mobilization exceeded even pessimistic Japanese projections. Admiral Yamamoto's warnings had been accurate. His prediction that Japan could fight successfully for 6 months but faced mounting difficulties thereafter, proved correct almost to the day. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. From that moment forward, American industrial advantages made Japanese defeat inevitable. The mathematics were implacable. The nation that could build 24 Essex-class carriers, while its opponent struggled to complete 4 fleet carriers, would win through attrition regardless of tactical outcomes in individual battles. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.